Joyce Carter stepped into the exclusive boutique, her presence understated yet striking. Her dark skin glowed under the soft, ambient lighting, and her confident stride turned heads without her needing to announce herself. The boutique was quiet, its pristine shelves filled with luxury items designed for women who, in this place, looked like they belonged. Joyce had no intention of making a scene. She simply wanted to enjoy a peaceful browse. But as always, her mere presence seemed to unsettle the delicate balance of the store's usual clientele. As she made her way toward the new arrivals, a clerk named Simon approached her. His demeanor was stiff, almost too rehearsed, his eyes momentarily lingering on her clothes with thinly veiled judgment. His lips twitched upward, but it wasn't a smile. It was a smirk, one that Joyce immediately recognized as a sign of discomfort, perhaps even disdain. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone too polite, betraying a contemptuous edge that Joyce felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Joyce, used to this subtle discrimination, forced herself to smile. "Wes, I'd love to see some of your new arrivals." She reached for a nearby rack, pretending not to notice how Simon's eyes followed her every move. Without responding, Simon motioned for her to follow him, leading her toward a section of the store that felt oddly segregated from the more polished displays. The clothes were still expensive, but their styles were duller, more muted, as if chosen specifically for someone like her. Joyce's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure, determined not to let his behavior show. The air between them thickened as Simon lingered just a little too close, his gaze calculating. He was sizing her up, Joyce could feel it, measuring her worth not by her presence, but by the shade of her skin and the color of her outfit. "This one, maybe," Simon suggested, picking up a dress from the rack. He held it up in front of her with a studied casualness, as if deciding whether it would be appropriate for someone like Joyce. His lips curled into an almost imperceptible sneer. Joyce glanced at the dress, a bland, uninspired piece in a shade that washed out any semblance of vibrancy. It wasn't a choice, it was a suggestion that carried with it the message that she didn't belong here. "I was actually looking for something a bit more bold," Joyce replied, her voice calm but carrying an edge. She could feel the heat of his eyes boring into her as she returned the dress to the rack, unwilling to play into his game. Simon didn't back off. Instead, he crossed his arms and leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice just enough for her to hear. "I'm afraid bold isn't really your style," he said, his words clipped with unmistakable scorn. "We cater to a certain kind of clientele here. Maybe a more understated look would suit you better." But Joyce's blood ran cold at the implication. This wasn't just about fashion. This was about her being in a space where she wasn't supposed to exist. The undercurrent of his words carried the weight of every racist encounter she had endured over the years, the constant reminder that some people she didn't believe she belonged in places like this. No matter how carefully she dressed or carried herself, she opened her mouth to respond, but Simon cut her off, his voice now tinged with open hostility. "People like you, black people, don't really suit the clothes we have here." His sneer deepened as he spoke, the words dripping with venom. "Maybe you should try somewhere more fitting." Joyce froze. The shock of his words hit her like a slap, the sting radiating through her chest. His contempt was no longer subtle. It was innate, unashamed, and designed to hurt. The urge to leave before things escalated was overwhelming, but she refused to give him the satisfaction. Instead, she squared her shoulders, lifting her chin high, trying to maintain the dignity he so clearly wanted to strip from her. "I think it's you who needs to leave," she said, her voice low and firm, a quiet rage building inside her. But Simon, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged, only sneered further. "You're not welcome here. I'll call security if you don't leave now." The words felt like a challenge, a test she wasn't about to fail. Joyce stood her ground, refusing to be cowed by his hostility. But the discomfort lingered, suffocating her as the weight of his discrimination pressed in from all sides. "Thank you for the feedback. I understand what you mean. I'll revise Chapter 2 to focus more on turning the situation into something more dynamic, with more engaging plot points that escalate the tension in unexpected ways. Let's make the confrontation more interesting while maintaining the discomfort and growing intensity." Joyce's fingers clenched around the fabric of the dress Simon had shoved toward her, her mind racing. His words, dripping with contempt, echoed in her head. Black people don't really suit the clothes we have here. She knew the store. She knew its elitist, exclusionary atmosphere. But what Simon didn't know was that she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not today. Are you seriously telling me that? Joyce's voice was calm, too calm. Simon's smirk faltered, just for a second, as her piercing gaze locked onto his. I'm just saying it's not a good fit for you, Simon replied, trying to recover his composure. But Joyce could see the irritation rising in his eyes. His discomfort was almost palpable now. But Joyce wasn't about to let it go. Not when the anger had been building for years. Not when every cell in her body was screaming for action. She took a step closer, her heels clicking louder than she intended on the polished floor. It's funny, I thought stores like this were meant to sell clothes, not judgments. Simon's face twisted, his eyes flashing with barely concealed rage. He stepped back, his hands twitching, but his voice remained biting. You think you can just walk in here and I think you need to check yourself? Joyce interrupted, cutting him off, her voice sharp as a blade. For a split second, there was a flicker of hesitation in Simon's expression, a crack in his otherwise smug demeanor. But he quickly recovered, glaring at her with renewed venom. You should leave, he said, his words thick with venom. You're clearly disrupting the peace. It's not worth our time to keep you here. Joyce stood tall, refusing to back down. She wasn't the one disrupting anything, he was. And this wasn't just about some ridiculous notion of peace. This was about Simon's entitlement, his assumption that he had the power to decide who belonged in this space. But instead of leaving, Joyce took a different approach. She turned, slowly, her eyes scanning the boutique. You know, I think I'll stay, she said, her voice ice cold. She was testing him now, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. But maybe you should get your manager. As Simon's eyes widened, his confidence faltering. Manager? For what? For you. For you. Joyce's gaze didn't waver as she met his eyes. For treating me like I don't belong here. For assuming you have the right to dictate who shops and who doesn't. Simon's lips pressed into a thin line, but he wasn't ready to call for the manager. Instead, he took another step forward, his voice low, dangerous. I'm warning you. Leave now, or I'll have to take further action. Joyce smiled. Not a friendly smile, but one filled with defiance. And what kind of action are you going to take, Simon? She leaned in just slightly, watching his eyes flicker with uncertainty. You're threatening me for what? Because I refuse to be intimidated. Simon's face reddened. His earlier mockery had turned to outright hostility now, and Joyce knew it. But she wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. Get out of my store, Simon hissed, his voice no longer calm but frantic, almost desperate. His hand reached out as if to grab her arm. But Joyce stepped back just in time, her heart pounding with adrenaline. His attempt to physically confront her only showed how unprepared he was for someone who wouldn't take his abuse lying down. The force of his words hung in the air like a charged storm cloud, but Joyce was already moving. Without looking back, she turned on her heel, walking toward the exit. But not to leave. No, she was going to make sure Simon knew exactly who he was dealing with. As she neared the door, she paused, allowing the tension to stretch, savoring the moment of power. She spoke again, loud enough for the entire boutique to hear, her voice cutting through the stillness. I won't leave, Simon, she said, her words like a challenge, a vow. Not until you learn that people like me aren't going anywhere. Not today, not ever. But with one final glance at Simon, her eyes burning with resolve, she stepped out of the boutique, leaving behind a silence that felt thicker than any confrontation. But as Joyce walked down the street, she felt her pulse racing, not from fear, but from something else, something more dangerous. A plan was forming, a way to make Simon pay for what he'd done, for making her feel small. He would regret this. She would make sure of it. The cool breeze outside the boutique felt refreshing, but Joyce's mind was racing. Her pulse was still thumping in her ears as she walked briskly down the street, each step fueled by the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Her chest tightened with every breath. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long now bubbling to the top. This wasn't just about Simon's ugly words anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that she could no longer ignore. As Joyce rounded the corner, Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, a quick glance showing a message from Jonathan. "How are you? You okay?" She paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the screen. Jonathan was always the one to check in, his voice calm and steady when she needed it most. But today was different. Today she didn't want comfort. She didn't need reassurance. She needed action. She needed to make sure that this didn't go unchallenged. Not good. "Something happened at the store. I'll tell you later. I need to handle this." She hit send quickly, and the reply came almost immediately. "Call me if you need me. I'm here." Joyce shoved her phone back into her bag, her mind already working through the next steps. She couldn't let Simon off the hook so easily. His little outburst, his casual cruelty, needed to be broadcast, to be shared. This wasn't just about her dignity anymore. This was about everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel less than because of who they were. And Joyce was done being quiet. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp ding from her phone again. Another message from Jonathan. "Don't let them get to you. You've got this." Joyce's lips curled into a bitter smile. She appreciated Jonathan's faith in her, but this was something she needed to do alone. She wasn't going to back down, not after everything she'd been through, not after Simon had shown her who he truly was. It was time to make her next move. An hour later, Joyce sat in a quiet corner of a local coffee shop, her fingers furiously typing. She had reached out to a few friends, making sure they knew what had happened, getting their support, their voices, their stories, but she wasn't stopping there. She was drafting an open letter. She would expose Simon and the boutique for what they truly were, a place that only valued the wealthy and the privileged, a place where people like her community, didn't belong. The letter was fiery, raw, unapologetic. Joyce's words flowed as though she had been holding them back for years. She had been told time and time again to keep her head down, to ignore the slights, to just let it go. But today, Joyce had a new perspective. She had always believed in doing the right thing quietly. But not anymore. If they wanted her to leave, then they would have to see her stand tall and loud. Her fingers stopped typing for a moment as a thought crossed her mind. She needed to go further than just a letter. This needed to be heard by the right people, by the community, by anyone who had ever felt the sting of discrimination in places like Simon's boutique. She needed to hit them where it hurt. Without a second thought, she began crafting a post for social media. She included a picture of the boutique's window, its glossy exterior, its pristine displays, and the name of the store that would forever be linked to the moment that nearly broke her. But Joyce wasn't letting Simon win. She was turning this moment into something bigger. She was exposing the ugly truths that lay behind the designer dresses, the overpriced shoes, and the glimmering chandeliers. This is what happens when people like me step into spaces like this. They try to erase us. They try to break us down. They think we don't belong. She hesitated for only a second before hitting post, the weight of the decision sinking in. There was no turning back now. Simon would know who she was, but more importantly, the world would know. Just as Joyce hit post and put her phone down, an unexpected event shifted her entire perspective on the ordeal. She was still seething from the moment with Simon when she heard a voice behind her, soft but clear. "Excuse me, I overheard what happened in there. You okay?" Joyce turned to see a woman in her 30s, dressed in business attire, her face showing a mix of empathy and quiet anger. Her dark eyes were fixed on Joyce, and Joyce could see that she had noticed the entire exchange. "I'm fine," Joyce said, her voice a little softer than before. She didn't want to appear weak, but there was something comforting about this stranger's presence, as if she had walked through a similar fire and survived. "I'm Sarah," the woman said, offering a handshake. "I saw what that guy said to you in the boutique. You didn't deserve that. I've been in similar situations myself, and I want you to know you're not alone in this." Joyce shook her hand, feeling an unexpected rush of relief at Sarah's words. It wasn't every day that someone would step forward, especially in a situation like that, where the pressure to remain silent often outweighed the desire to speak out. But Sarah wasn't just an outsider looking in, she was an ally. Sarah continued, her voice firm. "I used to work in high-end fashion. I've seen how they treat people who don't fit the mold. That's the kind of stuff that needs to be exposed. What Simon did was disgusting, but you're stronger than he thinks. The sincerity in Sarah's words hit Joyce harder than expected, but what she said next took it even further. I've got contacts in media, journalists who cover inequality in these spaces. I could help you make sure your story gets the attention it deserves. We can get them to listen. The offer was everything Joyce needed to hear, and something inside her clicked. She wasn't in this fight alone. She had an ally, someone who understood and wanted to see change. But this wasn't just about getting her story out. It was about taking down the systems that allowed people like Simon to think they could get away with it. As Sarah began to exchange her contact information with Joyce, Joyce's phone buzzed again. This time it was a notification from the boutique's social media page. The store had posted a carefully worded apology, claiming a misunderstanding and stating that they do not tolerate discrimination of any kind. Joyce's stomach churned with a mix of disbelief and disgust. The apology felt hollow, empty, a ploy to save face without truly addressing the issue. But it was too late for them to cover it up now. The damage had been done. Joyce wasn't going to let it slide, not anymore. Are you going to let them get away with this? Sarah asked, her voice filled with resolve. Joyce didn't hesitate. No, she said, a new fire burning in her chest. No, it's time to make them regret it. Joyce's heart raced as she stared at the glowing screen of her phone. The post she had shared earlier in the day was blowing up. Comments, shares, and direct messages flooded in. It wasn't just her voice anymore. Others were speaking out. As she scrolled through the countless responses, one message stood out. It was from a woman named Erica, who had written, I was humiliated in that same store months ago. Simon told me I wouldn't look good in any of their clothes. He said they didn't cater to women like me. I left in tears, but I wish I had done something about it. Joyce's fingers trembled as she read the message. Erica wasn't the only one. More people came forward, their voices a chorus of shared frustration. A man named James wrote, I watched Simon treat a black woman with such disrespect. It made me sick. I just didn't know what to do at the time, but I'm glad you're speaking up. The more Joyce read, the more she realized just how widespread this behavior had been. The boutique wasn't just a place of luxury for some. It was a place of humiliation for many, especially for people of color. What had happened to her was a symptom of a much larger issue. But Joyce wasn't just feeling a sense of solidarity, she felt a rising tide of anger. She wasn't going to let this go, not after reading all these stories. She took a deep breath and began typing a new post, one that would pull the curtain back on the truth of what had been happening inside those walls. This isn't just my story. It's the story of so many others who have been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. I won't be silenced, and neither should you. Share your story. Let's make them listen. As she hit post, Joyce felt something shift within her, a sense of purpose stronger than ever. She wasn't alone in this fight, and it was time to take it further. The next morning, Joyce received a call that made her stomach churn. It was from David Thomas, the store manager. Miss Carter. He began, his voice stiff and awkward. I'm calling to apologize for what happened at our boutique yesterday. We take these matters very seriously, and Simon's behavior is absolutely unacceptable. We are launching an internal review. Joyce could hear the rehearsed tone in his voice, the fake sincerity. Are you going to fire him? She asked flatly. I can't make that decision immediately, he stammered. But there will be consequences. I assure you, this isn't the way we do business here. Joyce exhaled sharply. You can fire him all you want, but it doesn't change the fact that this kind of discrimination happens every day in your store. I'm not the only one. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Joyce could feel the tension, the weight of his guilt hanging in the air. I understand, Ms. Carter. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, he said, his voice less confident now. Joyce hung up, knowing full well that this wasn't the end. She wasn't looking for empty apologies, she wanted action. As Joyce's social media post went viral, the attention began to build. More stories came pouring in, and what had started as one woman's fight for dignity became a movement. People shared their own experiences not just with Simon, but with others in the store who had been equally dismissive or hostile toward customers who weren't white, wealthy, or perfect. Enough. Joyce's phone rang again that afternoon. This time, it wasn't the boutique reaching out. It was a local news outlet that had picked up the story. They wanted to follow up on her post and asked if she was available for a statement. But Joyce didn't have time for a media circus. She was focused on the bigger picture now. This wasn't about a few viral moments or interviews. It was about pushing for real change. Before she could dwell on it too much, the doorbell rang. Joyce opened it to find a courier holding a small package. "It's for you, ma'am," the delivery man said. Confused, Joyce took the box and opened it. Inside was a letter, thick with paper and sealed with a wax emblem. She tore it open, her hands shaking as she read the words inside. "Your actions have consequences, Joyce. There are things you don't understand, things you've opened that can't be closed. I will make sure you regret this. Consider this a warning." Joyce dropped the letter in shock. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew it was Simon. His words dripped with malice. Her hands clenched into fists. She had expected backlash, but this felt different, dangerous. She turned toward the window, her mind racing. She had poked the hornet's nest, and now someone was coming for her? Joyce's phone buzzed incessantly. She had barely been able to sleep the past few nights, haunted by the threat in that letter. Every shadow seemed to lurk with a deeper intent. Every unfamiliar sound set her on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. But she refused to let fear control her. The social media storm she had ignited continued to spread like wildfire. People were rallying behind her, telling their own stories of discrimination. And it was clear now that the public was demanding more than just an apology from the boutique. As Joyce sat at her kitchen table, her mind focused on one thing. She couldn't stop now, not when the stakes had grown this high. The doorbell rang again, snapping her from her thoughts. Joyce looked up at the clock. Night had fallen, and she hadn't been expecting anyone. She hesitated for a moment, her heart hammering in her chest, before she made her way to the door. Opening it slowly, she was met by a stranger, tall, with a hard expression on his face. He looked vaguely familiar, but Joyce couldn't place him immediately. "I'm here for Joyce Carter," the man said, his tone cold. Joyce took a step back instinctively. "I'm her. Who are you?" "Simon sent me," the man replied, his eyes narrowing. "He's not happy with you poking your nose into things that don't concern you. You've made a big mistake." But before she could respond, the man took a step forward, his body language aggressive. Joyce's breath caught in her throat as she realized the danger she was in. She stammered, but her words died in her throat. The man pushed past her and into the apartment, grabbing her by the arm with a firm grip that sent shockwaves of panic through her body. "Let go of me," Joyce shouted, trying to break free, but the man tightened his hold. Her mind raced, frantically searching for a way to escape, but her legs felt like lead rooted to the spot. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the hallway, followed by a voice Joyce never expected to hear. "Hey, let her go." Joyce's heart leapt in her chest as she turned to see a man, tall, well-built, and with a confident stride, charging toward them. The intruder looked over his shoulder just in time to see the man approaching. "Who the hell are you?" The man snarled, his grip loosening just for a moment. "I'm the one who's about to stop you from making a big mistake," the man said firmly. Without a second thought, he lunged at the intruder, knocking him back into the living room. Joyce's heart pounded in her ears as she scrambled to the side, watching in disbelief as the stranger and the intruder exchanged blows. The struggle didn't last long. The man who had come to her defense was stronger, faster. Within moments, the intruder was pinned to the ground, and Joyce heard him yell in pain. "Stay down," the man barked. "I'm calling the cops." The intruder's face twisted in fury, but he knew he'd been beaten. As the man reached for his phone, Joyce's world seemed to stop. She could barely process what had just happened. She was safe. For now. The police arrived within minutes, and soon the intruder was cuffed and being led out of her apartment. The man who had saved her stood beside her, his protective stance never wavering. Joyce still couldn't believe it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. The man nodded. "You don't need to thank me. But you're not alone in this. No one should have to face this kind of thing by themselves." Joyce managed a weak smile, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This stranger, This protect had given her something she didn't think she could have, a sense of peace. As the police car pulled away with the intruder in tow, Joyce turned back into her apartment, her head spinning. She was still processing everything: the threat, the support from strangers, and the message Simon had sent. But there was no time for weakness now. The next morning, Joyce woke up to an unexpected call. It was David Thomas, the store manager. "Ms. Carter, I need to personally apologize again. Simon was arrested last night, and I've launched a full investigation into the matter," he said. His voice sounded genuine, almost remorseful. Joyce didn't trust him. Not after everything that had happened, but it was a step in the right direction. "We'll do better, I promise you," Thomas added. But Joyce wasn't interested in apologies anymore. "I appreciate the words, Mr. Thomas," she said coolly, "but words aren't enough. I want to see real change. Not just at your store, but across the board. No one should ever face what I did. And I'm not stopping until this is addressed." She hung up the phone, feeling empowered. For the first time in a long while, Joyce felt in control. The fight wasn't over, but she had made her mark. Simon's actions had sparked something much bigger than him, something that couldn't be undone. The story of what happened in that boutique spread quickly from social media to news outlets. The outcry was deafening. Joyce's voice had broken through the noise, and with the support of others, she had forced the issue into the spotlight. Simon's life had unraveled in the wake of his actions. The boutique faced heavy backlash and lost loyal customers. The manager did his best to recover, but the stain of discrimination was hard to erase. And as for Joyce, she continued to speak out, using her platform to push for change, to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. The road ahead was still challenging, but Joyce knew one thing for sure: she would never back down.